in today's video, we are reacting to serial killers who were police officers. Man, ain't that crazy? The people out set to protect and serve you are the ones that are gonna backdoor you. Now I know certain people out there already don't trust police. They think they're crooked. They think they're this. They think they that. Whatever. You know what I'm saying? I'm not gonna sit here and say I'm a big fan of the police myself, but still, damn, that's got to be crazy. You know what I'm saying? A man that's supposed to protect you turns out to be yo killer. You know? It's fucked up. But with that being said, man, let's go and get to the video and see what it's talking about.
Schaefer Jr., the killer cop. July 21st, 1972. Two teenage girls, Nancy Trotter and Pamela Wells, were hitchhiking near Fort Lauderdale, Florida, when a police officer pulled over and offered them a ride. He seemed official, professional, safe. He was a Martin County Sheriff's deputy named Gerard Schaefer. The girls got in his patrol car. It was a decision they barely survived. Schaefer drove them to a remote wooded area, claiming he was taking them somewhere safe. Instead, he forced them from the car at gunpoint, marched them into the woods, tied them to trees, and placed nooses around their necks. He left them there, terrified and helpless.
At first, I thought he was gonna make them give them some neck. Not saying that would have been the right call, but like, you know what I'm saying? Like throwing the neck, that's one thing, but you just like making them put up nooses? Bro, you just did that shit for the love of the game.
Saying he'd return. But before he could come back to finish what he'd started, another officer happened upon the scene during a routine patrol. Trotter and Wells were rescued. Schaefer was arrested. He was fired from the sheriff's department immediately. But investigators quickly realized that Schaefer's attempted abduction of Trotter and Wells wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that had been going on for years. While searching Schaefer's home, police found a horrifying collection: jewelry, clothing, and personal items belonging to dozens of young women. They found graphic stories and drawings depicting torture, murder, and mutilation. They found details.
Man, they gotta go harder with that goddamn psychiatric testing, whatever. Because, you know what I'm saying, not everybody's fit to be a cop, you know? You give the wrong person power, bro, they do fucked up shit like this, bro. It's crazy.
Descriptions of hangings, stabbings, and sexual violence. Some appeared to be fiction. Others were clearly accounts of real crimes. In September 1972, the decomposed bodies of two teenage girls, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, were discovered on Hutchinson Island. They'd been missing since April. Both had been tied to trees, tortured, raped, shot, and hacked to death. The method matched exactly what Schaefer had attempted with Trotter and Wells. Physical evidence linked him to the crime scene. Schaefer was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in 1973 and sentenced to 2 life terms. But investigators believe he killed many more. Personal items belonging to numerous missing women were found in his possession. He was suspected in the disappearances of at least 30 young women and girls across Florida. What's particularly chilling about Schaefer is that he'd been using his authority as a police officer to commit these crimes for years before his arrest. He'd pick up hitchhikers, runaways, and young women traveling alone. His badge made them trust him. His patrol car made them feel safe, and he used that trust to torture and kill them. Schaefer was also known as the hangman because of his signature method. He'd bind his victims to trees with nooses around their necks, a sadistic ritual that gave him a sense of power and control. He later claimed, in letters and stories he wrote from prison, that he'd been killing since 1965, when he was just 19 years old. He boasted of killing women on 3 continents and claimed his victim count was between 80 and 110, though he could never remember exact details. Even in prison, Schaefer remained disturbing. He wrote graphic fiction that many believed were thinly veiled accounts of his real crimes. He filed frivolous lawsuits against anyone who called him a serial killer, despite the overwhelming evidence. He even claimed to have been friends with Ted Bundy, who was incarcerated in the same Florida prison, though Bundy dismissed Schaefer as a wannabe. On December 3rd, 1995,
Damn, nigga, that's my birthday. What the fuck?
A fellow inmate entered Schaefer's cell and attacked him. The inmate slit his throat and stabbed him over 40 times, focusing on his eyes. Gerard Schaefer died at age 49. The man who'd used his badge to prey on vulnerable young women, who'd tortured and killed for his own sadistic pleasure, met a violent end behind the same bars that had held many of his victims' stories. Mikhail Popkov, the werewolf. June 2012. Angarsk, Russia. Police investigators were conducting mandatory DNA testing of current and former police officers in the Irkutsk region. They were searching for a serial killer who'd been terrorizing the area for 2 decades. When they tested the DNA of Mikhail Popkov, a 48-year-old former officer, they got a match. The friendly, charismatic cop who everyone loved had been hiding a monstrous secret. Between 1992 and 2010, Popkov murdered at least 83 women, making him Russia's most prolific serial killer in history. He surpassed even Andrei Chikatilo, the notorious butcher of Rostov. And he did it all while working as a police officer and later as a security guard. Popkov's method was terrifyingly simple and effective. He'd patrol the streets of Angarsk in his police car or his personal vehicle, a Lada 4x4 off-road vehicle commonly used by law enforcement. He'd offer rides to women late at night, particularly those who were intoxicated or appeared to be sex workers. They'd get in the car because he was a cop. They trusted the badge. Once they were in his vehicle, he'd drive them to remote wooded areas. There, he'd attack them with whatever weapon he had available: axes, hammers, screwdrivers, knives. He'd rape them, mutilate them, and leave their bodies in forests, along roadsides or in cemeteries. Some victims had over 150 stab wounds. The brutality was so extreme that Russian media nicknamed him the werewolf and the Angarsk maniac. What makes Popkov's case even more disturbing is that he investigated his own crimes. He was assigned to work on cases involving missing women and bodies that he himself had left behind. He'd interview suspects, handle evidence from his own crime scenes, and participate in police discussions about the killer they were hunting. He was literally investigating himself. Popkov later claimed he was motivated by a perceived infidelity. In 1992, he believed he caught his wife having an affair. Though she denied it, Popkov became consumed with rage toward women he deemed immoral. He saw himself as a cleaner, purging the streets of prostitutes and women living what he considered debauched lives. For years, police had no leads. Bodies kept appearing, but the killer seemed impossible to catch. Then, investigators noticed a pattern. Tire tracks from a Lada 4x4, a vehicle commonly used by police, kept appearing at crime scenes. That's when they decided to DNA test current and former officers. Popkov's DNA matched evidence from multiple murders. When confronted, Popkov confessed, not just to a few murders, but to dozens. In 2015, he was convicted of 22 murders and sentenced to life in prison. Then, in 2017, he confessed to 59 more killings. He was convicted of 56 additional murders in 2018, receiving a second life sentence. The man who'd been trusted.
Like, what was the point of that? The nigga was already gonna do live, so you just like, nigga, like, what? Like, nigga, it's not like if this nigga, like, you know, is what's the word? Not revitalized, but like when people say spiritual, you come back in another body. It's not like if he comes back to this world in another body, he's gonna immediately go right back to jail. Like, no.
To protect his community, who attended police functions and was described by colleagues as funny and charming, had been one of history's most prolific serial killers. His wife and daughter had no idea. His colleagues had no idea. He'd hidden in plain sight for 18 years, using his badge as both a shield and a weapon. Mikhail Popkov is now 60 years old, serving his sentence in Russia's Black Dolphin prison, one of the country's most brutal facilities. He'll spend the first 15 years in solitary confinement, and he'll never leave prison alive. Gennady Mikosevich, the volunteer officer killer. Between 1971 and 1985, the city of Vitebsk in the Soviet Union was terrorized by a serial killer targeting young women. 36 women were confirmed murdered, though the real number may be closer to 60. They were raped, strangled, and left in various locations around the city. The police had suspects, they had confessions, they even had convictions. There was just one problem. They had the wrong people. Gennady Mikosevich was a volunteer police officer, a member of the Voluntary People's Druzhina, a citizen patrol organization in the USSR. He was often assigned to investigate the very murders he'd committed. He'd interview suspects, handle evidence, and participate in case discussions. And when the pressure mounted to solve the crimes, he helped ensure other men took the fall. 13 innocent men were arrested and convicted for Mikosevich's murders.
Damn.
12 were sent to forced labor camps in Siberia. Brutal.
Damn. Ain't that about a bitch? That's gotta be fucking crazy, going to prison for something you didn't even do, bro. Damn, that's gotta be ass.
Gulags where many died. One man was tortured into confessing, then executed by firing squad for a crime he didn't commit. Mikosevich watched it all happen and said nothing. He kept killing. What makes Mikosevich's case particularly horrifying is how he manipulated the Soviet justice system. He knew exactly how investigations worked how confessions were obtained, how cases were built. He used that knowledge to frame others, to deflect suspicion, and to continue his crimes for 14 years. But eventually, investigators began to notice patterns. Despite having different suspects in custody, the murders continued. The methods were too similar, too consistent to be the work of multiple killers. Someone realized that all these crimes had to be connected, committed by a single person. Worried that he was about to be discovered, Mikasevich tried one last manipulation. He sent an anonymous letter to police, signed Patriot of Vitebsk, claiming that the murders were the result of the corruption of Soviet society. He thought this would throw investigators off his trail, or make them dismiss the cases as political rather than criminal. It backfired spectacularly. Police began analyzing handwriting samples from every man in the region. They compared the anonymous letter to writing samples from over 500,000 males in the oblast. The analysis pointed directly to Gennady Mikasevich. When confronted with the evidence, Mikasevich confessed. He admitted to 36 murders and described how he'd used his position as a volunteer officer to commit the crimes and cover his tracks. He showed no remorse for the innocent men he'd sent to labor camps, or the one who'd been executed. Mikasevich was sentenced to death and sent to prison. Reports indicate he committed suicide while awaiting execution, though some accounts suggest he may have been killed by other inmates or guards who were disgusted by his crimes and his betrayal of the badge. His case became the first serial killer case publicly acknowledged by Soviet state media. For years, the USSR had denied that serial killers even existed within their borders, claiming such crimes were a product of capitalist society. Mikasevich's arrest and confession shattered that propaganda and revealed the deep corruption within Soviet law enforcement. At least 36 families lost daughters, sisters, and mothers to a man who wore a police uniform. And 13 innocent men had their lives destroyed by that same man, sent to gulags or executed for crimes they never committed. Justice came too late for all of them. Antoinette Frank, the officer who killed for money. March 4, 1995, New Orleans, Louisiana. Police responded to a shooting at the Kim Ann restaurant in New Orleans East. When they arrived, they found 3 people dead. Officer Ronald Williams, who'd been working security at the restaurant, and siblings Quang Vu and Ha Vu, members of the family that owned the establishment. It appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. But when investigators started piecing together the evidence, they discovered something shocking. The killer wasn't a stranger. It was Antoinette Frank, a New Orleans Police Department officer who'd been working with Williams that night. And this wasn't her first time robbing the Kim Ann restaurant. Antoinette Frank had joined the NOPD in 1993, despite multiple red flags during her psychological evaluation and background check. She'd failed the psychological screening twice and was noted to have poor impulse control and questionable judgment. But the department was desperate for officers and hired her anyway.
You know they was desperate. They hired a fucking black lady as a cop at that time. Yeah, them niggas was desperate for sure.
It was a decision that would cost 3 people their lives. Frank had befriended the Vu family, who owned the restaurant, and she'd often stop by while on patrol. She seemed friendly, trustworthy. In reality, she was casing the place. In November 1994, Frank and her accomplice, Rogers Lacaze, had already robbed the restaurant once. The Vu family never reported it because they didn't want trouble with the police. But Frank wasn't satisfied. She decided to rob them again, this time with Lacaze. On the night of March 4th, Frank was supposed to be on duty patrolling with Officer Ronald Williams. Instead, she arranged to meet Lacaze at the restaurant for another robbery. When Frank and Lacaze entered the Kim Ann restaurant, they didn't know that Williams was inside working a security detail. When Williams saw Frank with Lacaze and realized what was happening, Frank made a choice. She shot her fellow officer in the head, killing him instantly. Then she and Lacaze murdered Quang Vu and Ha Vu to eliminate witnesses. What Frank didn't know was that someone had survived. Chow Vu, a sibling, had hidden in a walk-in cooler during the shooting. After Frank and Lacaze fled, Chow emerged and called 911. When police arrived at the scene, Frank had the audacity to return in her patrol car, pretending to respond to the call like any other officer. She walked into the crime scene and asked what happened, trying to appear shocked and concerned. But Chow Vu identified her immediately. Frank was arrested on the spot. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Ballistic
Nigga, you a bold nigga to do this crime and then come back and act like you ain't. Man, yeah, lock her ass up.
matched her service weapon to the murders. Lacaze confessed and implicated her. Witnesses placed her at the scene. In September 1995, Antoinette Frank was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and armed robbery. She was sentenced to death. For over 25 years, Frank has been on death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, one of only 2 women on Louisiana's death row. She's exhausted most of her appeals. She maintains her innocence, claiming she was framed, but the evidence against her remains irrefutable. Antoinette Frank represents one of the most brazen examples of a police officer using their badge not just to kill, but to rob and murder for financial gain. She betrayed her fellow officer, killed innocent people, and then tried to investigate her own crime scene. She was 23 years old when she committed these murders, making her one of the youngest cops-turned-killers in American history. She's now 52, still waiting for an execution date that may or may not ever come. Norbert Poelke, the Hammer Killer. March 1984, Germany. Police officer Norbert Poelke's daughter died from cancer, leaving his family devastated and buried under approximately $400,000 in medical debt. Poelke was a veteran officer with years of service, a respected member of his community, but the financial pressure broke something inside him. Between May 1984 and October 1985, a series of eerily similar crimes terrorized West Germany. A masked assailant would rob banks using a specific method. He'd smash the teller window with a sledgehammer, demand money, then flee in a stolen car. Hours or days later, the owner of that stolen car would be found dead, shot in the head, usually in a wooded area near the bank. It happened at least 3 times, and investigators realized they were dealing with a serial killer. But this wasn't a typical serial killer motivated by psychological compulsion or sexual gratification. This was someone killing to cover their tracks during robberies, someone methodical and calculating. The police investigation was extensive. They analyzed the crime scenes, the ballistics, the patterns, and slowly, the evidence began pointing in a direction no one wanted to believe, toward one of their own. Norbert Poelke fit the profile. He had access to weapons. He knew how investigations worked. He understood forensics and crime scene analysis. And he desperately needed money. When investigators dug deeper, they found connections between Poelke and the crimes. Before police could arrest him, Poelke made his final choice. He committed suicide, leaving behind a note that many interpreted as a confession, though he never explicitly admitted to the murders. His death ended the investigation and closed the cases, but it left many questions unanswered. Investigators believe Poelke was responsible for at least 3 murders connected to his bank robberies, possibly more. His family's financial desperation had driven him to robbery, and his need to avoid capture had turned him into a killer. What's particularly tragic about Poelke's case is how it started. He wasn't a sadistic psychopath or a power-hungry predator. He was a father trying to pay for his daughter's medical treatment, a man crushed by debt in a system that failed his family. But that doesn't excuse what he became. He murdered innocent people, stealing their cars and their lives just to cover up his robberies. Norbert Poelke's case serves as a dark reminder that even those who start with understandable motivations can descend into unforgivable acts. The badge he wore was meant to protect people. Instead, he used his knowledge as an officer to kill them and evade justice. His suicide meant he never faced trial, never answered for his crimes, and never gave his victims' families the closure they deserved. Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. April 24, 2018. A quiet suburban neighborhood in Sacramento, California. Police surrounded a modest home and arrested a 72-year-old former mechanic named Joseph DeAngelo. His neighbors described him as a grumpy old man who yelled at people to stay off his lawn. They had absolutely no idea they'd been living next to one of California's most prolific serial killers for decades. Between 1974 and 1986, DeAngelo terrorized California under multiple names: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, and eventually the Golden State Killer. He committed at least 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 120 burglaries across the state. He'd break into homes in the middle of the night, wake couples at gunpoint, bind them with elaborate knots, and assault them for hours. He'd eat food from their refrigerators, steal random items, and
damn, nigga, the audacity, you gonna beat my ass and eat my fried chicken, nigga? Ain't that about a bitch?
sometimes call victims months later just to taunt them. What makes this case particularly disturbing is what DeAngelo was doing during many of these attacks. He was a police officer, first with the Exeter Police Department, then with the Auburn Police Department. By day, he was investigating burglaries and patrolling neighborhoods. By night, he was committing the exact crimes he was supposed to be solving. DeAngelo used his police training to perfection. He knew how to avoid detection, how to cover his tracks, how investigations worked. He'd study his victims for weeks, learning their schedules, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He was meticulous, calculated, and seemingly untouchable. His law enforcement career ended in 1979 when he was fired from the Auburn Police Department for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a store. Ironically, these were tools he likely planned to use in his crimes. But even after losing his badge, DeAngelo didn't stop. He continued killing until 1986, then vanished into suburban anonymity for 32 years. What finally caught him? DNA and genetic genealogy. In 2018, investigators uploaded crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database, found distant relatives, built a family tree, and it led them straight to DeAngelo. When police surveilled him and collected his DNA from a discarded item, it was a perfect match. The man who'd used his badge as a weapon, who'd terrorized an entire state while wearing a uniform, had finally been caught by the very technology he never could have imagined. Joseph DeAngelo pleaded guilty in 2020 to 13 counts of murder and multiple kidnappings. He's serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He's 80 years old now, and the families of his victims finally have justice, though it came 4 decades too late. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and
Yeah, man. With that being said, man, y'all let me know y'all thoughts on this in the comment section below. Hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. Every single sub is greatly appreciated. And until next time, peace.